It was the spring of 1958 when bush pilot Henry Callen lifted off from the gravel airstrip outside Whitehorse, his small Cessna 172 carrying mail fuel and a single sealed crate. The flight was routine, a short haul north through the Yukon wilderness to Aklavik. The weather was calm, the lake ice thinning, the kind of day pilots called a clear run. Yet Henry never made it. By dusk, only static filled the radio band. Search planes combed the delta for weeks, finding nothing but a torn envelope drifting near the shallows, his wife's name smudged by water. The case froze with the lake, another man swallowed by northern air. 40 years later, a sonar sweep beneath Lake Aklavik revealed the shadow of a plane intact, resting 26 feet down. Inside, a map folded twice, a headset with 2 voices recorded, and a red line that led nowhere on any chart. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The wind carried the smell of spruce and oil that morning, sharp enough to sting the eyes. At the Whitehorse airstrip, Henry Callen moved between the wings of his Cessna 172, gloved hands steady despite the cold. He'd done this run 100 times. A mail drop, a fuel drum for the mission school, 1 crate marked fragile. The date was April 12th, 1958, when the Yukon thawed unevenly and the air stayed thin and unpredictable. The mechanic Edgar Rourke watched from the hangar, jotting a quick note in the log, Callen visual check only. No anomalies. He would later remember that Henry's inspection was hurried more than usual, his flight jacket still unzipped as he climbed into the cockpit. The propeller turned once, twice, then caught. The flight plan filed under his name showed a direct route, Whitehorse to Aklavik, 4 hours. No diversions, no passengers. Yet in the corner of the page, a faint second signature, initials no one could later identify, slanted upward beside the coordinates for Lake Aklavik. May Callen would later say her husband had been distracted that week, pacing the kitchen at night, muttering about closing something off before spring melt. She thought he meant the accounts. At 8:20 a.m., the Cessna lifted into the pale sky. Henry waved once toward the hangar, then banked west over the timberline. The radio crackled his last words, route steady, altitude 2,000. After that, static. By noon, the weather began to turn. Reports from the Mackenzie stations showed a downdraft forming over the valley, an unexpected pocket of cold air pressing down on the delta. At 3:45 p.m., a hunter near the lake heard an engine sputter and fade. The sound didn't crash or echo, it simply vanished into the cloud belt. The next morning, the RCMP logged a missing aircraft report. Sergeant Thomas Greaves took command. He wrote in his field journal, visibility poor. Pilot known for caution, if downed impact unlikely to be violent. Search grid established. For 7 days, the air patrol swept the delta. They found an oil sheen on the water's surface and a torn map corner snagged against driftwood. The map's paper was brittle, its ink bled beyond recognition, except for one line, a red one drawn in pencil across the lake and ending abruptly at its northern edge. May identified it as Henry's handwriting. He always drew his routes in red, she said. Never trusted the printed charts. Divers attempted to search the area once the ice broke, but the lake's murky bottom and heavy silt turned the operation futile. After a month, Greaves wrote the final entry in his notebook, presumed lost. Case inactive until further evidence. Time buried the rest. The Callen farm sold. The hangar emptied. Edgar Rourke left aviation altogether. And May kept the torn piece of map in a drawer beside Henry's watch. Its glass cracked from the day she found it near the shoreline, the only item ever recovered. In 1997, nearly 40 years later, an environmental survey team mapping sediment patterns over Lake Aklavik captured a sonar image, a metallic outline 26 feet below the surface, shaped unmistakably like a small aircraft. The coordinates matched Henry's last route. When divers descended, they found the fuselage upright, half buried in silt propeller, intact cockpit sealed by sediment. Inside, wedged behind the seat, was a single item of paper folded twice. It was the same map. The red line still visible under the lamplight, a route no chart acknowledged cutting across restricted airspace toward a sector marked abandoned mining claim. Beneath that line, faint pencil notations listed times, distances, and a final word barely legible after 4 decades underwater cargo. The divers surfaced in silence. One held the map against the light, watching the ink shimmer like a wound that refused to close. The map's ink had run, but one red line remained. The recovered map sat under plexiglass in the RCMP lab, its paper brittle as dried leaves. Investigator Lydia Corin turned it slowly beneath the fluorescent light, tracing the red line that cut straight through forbidden airspace north of Aklavik. It was an impossible route, the kind a licensed pilot wouldn't risk unless there was reason to. The log of Henry Callen's last flight suggested he'd planned nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, in the old ledger where pilots signed out their runs, the line beneath his name was darker than the rest, ink pressed deep as if someone had signed for him. Archival weather reports from that week showed an unusual inversion, forming at 4 p.m. a layer of warm air, trapping cold fog beneath it. The timing matched the hunter's account almost perfectly. Lydia flipped through the reconstructed flight path, thinking about the missing hour between his last radio call and the moment the plane went silent. It was as if he'd simply flown into a gap one no record could fill. Witnesses interviewed in 1958 had described hearing the sputter, but one detail was always missing, whether the sound was above or below the clouds. Greaves had written possibly engine failure due to carburetor icing, a safe conclusion in any northern file. Yet tucked in the folder's corner was a single-page manifest signed by the flight clerk, Nora Phelps, listing the cargo Henry was to deliver. It showed the usual mail fuel drums and medical packages. Then one added line sealed container priority. No serial number, no consignee. And beside that a second signature, faint and hurried. Nora's handwriting appeared neat and symmetrical throughout, but that signature was different, masculine, angular, uncertain. For decades, no one had asked why. Lydia did. She found Nora, now 82, living in Dawson. The old woman kept her records in a box beneath the bed, yellowed papers smelling faintly of aviation fuel. When Lydia showed her a copy of the manifest, Nora adjusted her glasses and frowned. "That's not my line," she said, tapping the second handwriting. "I never added that cargo. He must have done it himself, or someone else did after." "But you checked it." "I stamped it because he asked me to hurry. Said he had daylight to beat." She paused, then added quietly, "There was a man with him. Not crew, not from here. Foreign accent. Didn't board, just handed him the envelope." In Greaves's notes, that man was never mentioned. The description Nora gave, heavy coat, silver cufflinks, didn't fit anyone local. When Lydia compared the ink from the second signature to samples from the mining company's flight authorization logs of that era, the match came back partial but distinct. The pigment contained a titanium additive used in government-issued pens of the 1950s, a detail impossible to fake decades later. It suggested someone with official access had amended the manifest after it was filed. When Lydia presented her findings to her supervisor, the reaction was silence. The old cases carried dust that no one wanted disturbed, but she pressed. She asked for the full unredacted copy of the manifest, and when it arrived, one word was blacked out. "Cargo." She stared at the thick rectangle of ink the way it swallowed the line beneath. Redactions weren't common for missing person files, especially solved ones. Yet here it was a single word erased from 40 years of record. Nora, seeing the document again, whispered, "They told me never to speak about that crate." "What crate?" "The one marked with the government seal. He didn't want to take it, I remember that." Outside the window, dusk settled over Dawson, the same low northern blue that once hung over Lake Aklavik. Lydia imagined the Cessna passing through that color, descending toward a place the map refused to name. The box beneath Nora's bed rattled faintly when she moved. Lydia bent to steady it, noticing the corner of another document, an old flight authorization slip issued 3 days before Henry's disappearance. It bore the same initials found on the back of the oil drum recovered years later, JL. Nora pressed her hand over it. He said the name was Lorne. Something Lorne. Lydia nodded, committing the name to memory even as the old woman refused to let the paper go. Outside, the light was nearly gone. In her car, Lydia read the manifest again, running her finger over the blackout bar. Beneath the ink, a faint impression bled through as if the typewriter had bitten too deep. She angled it under the dashboard lamp and saw the shadow of a single word rise faintly from the page. Cargo Minerals. The second signature trembled under it as though written in haste. She thought of the map's red line drawn not to Aklavik but to the mine beyond it, where the records claim no legal flights occurred. She took a breath, folded the page and slipped it back into its envelope. The last line of Greaves's 1958 report came back to her mind, no sign of illicit transport. Yet records show the manifest had been altered that same afternoon by someone who never signed his full name. In the clerk's statement, one word was redacted: cargo. The lake froze again by late May, sealing whatever rested beneath it. RCMP divers had tried twice before the thaw, but both attempts failed. Visibility reduced to arm's length, water so cold the lamps fogged from within. Sergeant Greaves noted in his final dispatch, "Search suspended pending seasonal change. No bodies recovered. Aircraft undetermined. The file went dormant, buried under procurement reports and oil permits." For decades, the wilderness itself held the evidence unbothered and unmarked. But every few years, something small surfaced. In 1961, a hunter found an oil drum half buried in the marsh just north of the lake. He reported it to the detachment in Inuvik, describing it as split open smelling of gasoline. The barrel was tagged photographed and forgotten. Only later, when Lydia reopened the file, did she notice its serial number faintly stenciled on one side, a half-erased code beginning with DNX 43. That prefix matched records from a private mining company operating north of Dawson in the 1950s Dominion Northern Extraction Limited. Lydia traced the mine's registration file. The site had been shuttered in 1958, just 3 months after Henry Callen's disappearance. Environmental notices listed logistical concerns, yet internal memos told a different story. Unreported air shipments, missing fuel receipts, and a pilot mentioned only by first name, Henry. When Lydia compared the mine's air manifests with the RCMP's weather logs, from that same week, she found overlapping times a company aircraft departing Dawson within 10 minutes of Henry's takeoff. The destinations were both marked Aklavik, one filed, one not. She imagined the two planes climbing together, one legal, one off the books. The theory made sense until she reached a memo dated April 10, 1958, escort clearance denied. The term escort, repeated across 4 documents, circled each time in red pencil by an unknown reviewer. She returned to the oil drum. The lab's digital enhancement revealed more than corrosion beneath the grime. Faint knife scratches formed 2 initials, JL, the same ones Nora Phelps had mentioned. At first, Lydia assumed they referred to the mysterious J. Lorne. But a deeper search through mining employment archives unearthed a different name. James Lorne, a mid-level supervisor listed as missing, presumed deceased in a mine accident. The very same month, Henry vanished. His file ended abruptly. No obituary, no follow-up. She spread the photographs across her desk. The oil drum, the map, the altered manifest. Together, they told a story of convergence, a pilot, a shipment, a mine, and a man who disappeared under 2 separate investigations. Back in 1958, Greaves had chased the same trail, though not as far. His notes from that summer read, "Inquiries to Dominion. Northern denied use of private aircraft. Site evacuated within week. Beneath it, a second line in different handwriting. Unconfirmed Callen may have carried prototype samples." That phrase, prototype samples, lingered. It was bureaucratic code for something unrecorded but valuable. Lydia called a retired transport officer, Arthur Dunn, who'd worked in Dawson during that era. He remembered the mine well. They pulled more than ore out of that ground, he said. Rumor was they were testing a refining compound, gold mixed with something volatile. Air transport only. Would that explain a sealed crate, she asked. Dunn hesitated. Maybe. Or it explains why a crate had to vanish. Lydia checked the government's cargo logs from the week of the crash. The page for April 12th was missing. The surrounding pages, April 11th and 13th, were intact. Someone had removed that single sheet from the archive sometime in the early 1960s. When she entered the missing date into the National Registry's microfilm index, a note appeared in the margin. Data transferred to Department of Northern Resources, 1964. The department had since dissolved. Its files, mostly unprocessed, were now stored in Ottawa under inactive administrative holdings. She filed a request for access. That night, she stayed in her office long after dark. The photos on her wall glowed faintly under the lamp, the red line on the map intersecting with a dot marked DNX. Henry's unapproved flight path led straight to the old mine site. She thought of May Callen, now old, still living quietly outside Whitehorse, who had once told a local paper, if he had secrets, they were buried where no one could dig. The wilderness could bury anything, Lydia realized, not only wreckage, but intent. Greaves's original journal described the search as orderly and uneventful. Yet records show his final entry was made 3 days after the file's official closure. The ink on that page was darker. The handwriting slanted differently. It read simply, "Item recovered. Transferred per instruction. No further action." The line below it, faint but visible under magnification, showed the initials JLL, again written in Greaves's own hand. This time followed by a single word mine. The pattern was clear now. Henry hadn't been alone in the air that day. Someone else had flown parallel, perhaps in the second aircraft, perhaps in his own. And somewhere between Whitehorse and Aklavik, their paths had crossed. Lydia marked the coordinates on her wall map, red string stretching between pins the same color Henry had once used. When she turned off the light, the string caught a sliver of reflection like a frozen river winding through the dark. The drum's lid bore 2 initials carved crudely with a knife. The letter arrived folded twice, postmarked from Inuvik, weeks after Henry's last flight. May found it among routine mail bills, catalogs, a church notice. The handwriting was her husband's, deliberate, slanted, slightly right. But the date on the envelope didn't make sense. April 22nd. 10 days after he'd vanished. She sat at the kitchen table, the oil lamp burning low, and read the first line. "If this reaches you before I do, don't worry. The weather's worse than forecast." The letter spoke of routine things, a broken gauge, a rough takeoff, a promise to be home by Thursday. Then, halfway down the page, a strange shift. "I'll have to make a stop by the lake. They said it's worth more than the plane itself. If it clears customs, we're done with this for good." The sentence ended abruptly, mid-word, as if interrupted. May pressed her fingers to the paper, tracing the indentations where his pen had stalled. She didn't tell anyone about the letter. Not the police, not even Greaves. She hid it in a metal tin under the bed, afraid it would twist the story of who her husband was. Decades later, when Lydia reopened the case, the letter surfaced in an evidence box mislabeled "Personal Effects." The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. Graphology confirmed it was Henry's handwriting. The envelope carried no sender's return, only the faint ghost of a stamp marked Aklavik Junction. Lydia noted how the phrasing matched the mining memos. She'd reviewed the same bureaucratic cadence, the same reference to clearance. She turned the letter over and saw that something was tucked inside a folded piece of paper identical to the torn map found near the lake. The edges aligned perfectly. When placed together, they formed the full route, a red line stretching from Whitehorse to Aklavik, then bending north toward the mine's coordinates. She scanned the paper under UV light. Faint traces of grease and graphite appeared near the fold. On the lower margin, almost invisible to the naked eye, were 3 digits 40 written in pencil. Altitude. Henry had written it as if reminding himself to stay low. The exact same figure the plane's altimeter would later freeze at. When Lydia interviewed May's brother-in-law Raymond, he remembered how May had withdrawn after the disappearance. She said something once, he told her. Said Henry was offered something private, a job maybe, not mail work. A courier job for a government contact. He paused, but she burned his uniform a week later. Didn't want anyone to ask questions. Lydia compared the letter's phrasing, worth more than the plane, to 1950s market values. A new Cessna 172 cost around $10,000 then. Whatever the shipment was, it had to be extraordinary. When she logged the evidence into the modern case file, a supervisor questioned the letter's authenticity. Could be forged, sent by someone else to throw off suspicion, he said. Lydia disagreed. The paper stock and ink composition matched samples from Henry's own journal, and the map inside carried his fingerprint on the fold partial, but confirmed by ridge analysis. That night, Lydia reread the last sentence aloud in the archive room. The words echoed through the quiet like a warning from another era. If it clears customs by the lake, the dash trailed off into nothing. The more she studied the case, the more it resembled two investigations layered over one another, one visible, one erased. The oil drum, the altered, manifest the red line on the map, now the letter. Each clue pointed toward an unregistered cargo route that vanished under the cover of weather and jurisdiction. Lydia stared at the evidence board where the line of string traced Henry's flight path. The knot marking the lake was tight pulled slightly upward. She followed it with her fingertip, whispering the unfinished words. If it clears, customs by the lake. She imagined Henry descending through cloud radio silent crate strapped behind his seat. Maybe he saw another aircraft below him or a signal light from the ice. Maybe he understood then that he wasn't delivering cargo at all, but burying it. In the corner of the letter, the ink had bled into a shape resembling a wingtip. Or maybe it was just coincidence, a trick of time and moisture. Lydia filed the document under recovered correspondence primary evidence and marked it for reanalysis. The next morning, when she returned to the lab, the ultraviolet scanner displayed the note again. The faint 400 shimmered under the lens. But there was something else she hadn't seen before. A second penciled line parallel to the first, drawn in the same faint graphite. It curved slightly west, away from the lake. Someone else had drawn it, or Henry had planned two routes. When Lydia printed the overlay and aligned it with the original map, the new line ended nowhere. Just open terrain, blank white. Yet a small dot barely visible beneath the fold marked its end. A dot shaped like a hand-drawn cross. The letter ends mid-sentence. If it clears customs by the lake. When the case files from 1958 were finally digitized, Lydia found something buried deep in the external assistance folder, a receipt typed on thin carbon paper marked Dominion Northern Extraction Limited. Aerial Division. It authorized a support flight to Aklavik under the pretense of weather reconnaissance. The name of the pilot was blacked out, but the date matched Henry's last flight exactly. In the right margin, someone had scrawled a note in pencil. Escort confirmed. Clearance pending. It wasn't common for private mining operations to offer aerial assistance to RCMP searches, yet Greaves's own report from that week mentioned civilian observers providing logistics. Lydia suspected the help wasn't volunteered. It was coordinated. The mining company had reason to watch what surfaced in that lake. She found a second receipt. Same header, different tone. Fuel advance approved, 100 gallons billed to operations budget. In the remarks section, urgent replacement shipment. High value. The payment ledger showed it cleared 2 days before Henry vanished. In 1958, the phrase high value was never used lightly. Lydia imagined Henry standing beside his Cessna, unaware that he was one line item in a larger transaction. The deeper she searched, the more the threads tangled. One name appeared across multiple manifests, Arthur Dunn listed as transport liaison, but the handwriting varied as if several people had signed under his title. Lydia had already interviewed the real Arthur Dunn, now in his 80s. He swore he'd never authorized parallel flights. We had one bird, one pilot, he said. No doubles. Still, the archive suggested otherwise. At 11 p.m. that night, Lydia scrolled through the scanned logbooks page by page. Most were routine weather notes, refueling tallies, maintenance tags. Then buried between 2 pages of calibration data, she saw an anomaly. A small flight entry, no date, no signature, just coordinates, 64 degrees in, 135 degrees out, and a single line lifted with C-172 escort trailing. The coordinates pointed to a stretch of wilderness 20 miles west of Aklavik. If the escort was real, it meant Henry's Cessna hadn't been alone that day. The discovery was enough to justify a full forensic reanalysis. The sonar data from 1997, when the wreck was first found, had recorded more than one metallic reflection under the water. At the time, it was dismissed as debris scatter. Lydia requested the original scan file. The lab technician re-rendered the model in 3D, filtering out sediment distortion. Two distinct objects appeared, one the known Cessna fuselage, the other smaller, irregular, lying roughly 20 meters away. She stared at the screen, the faint outline pulsing in sonar blue. Could be a crate, the technician said, or something that broke off mid-descent. Lydia nodded but said nothing. The next morning, she called the dive unit. A retrieval request was filed, though the weather made scheduling uncertain. Early spring ice still drifted along the shallows. The team estimated 2 weeks before conditions improved. In the meantime, Lydia returned to the manifest evidence. Among the scanned microfilms, she found a faint annotation scrawled by an unknown hand on a government memo dated April 14th, 1958. Secondary shipment verified. Same pilot, altered route. The memo had been redacted during the original investigation, but the carbon copy retained the imprint of every line. When she inverted the image, another note appeared beneath it, duplicate map stored for record. That explained the twin maps, one recovered by police, the other hidden inside Henry's letter. Someone had ensured both copies existed, perhaps as insurance. By now, the pattern was undeniable. 2 shipments, 2 routes, 1 crash. The aviator's map, pinned to Lydia's corkboard, had grown crowded with red string. The first red line Henry's tracked the official flight. The second fainter line she'd discovered on the UV overlay paralleled it closely before veering off into open lake. Somewhere along those paths, 2 aircraft may have met or collided. She stared at the convergence point until the lines seemed to move beneath the lamplight, crossing like veins. Later that week, she met Joseph Embry, a retired miner who'd worked at Dominion Northern in the late 1950s. His hands still bore the fine gray stains of ore dust that never fully washed away. "We weren't supposed to talk about those flights," he said, sipping weak coffee. "Said it was for testing extraction methods. But they never brought samples back, only sent them out." "What kind of ore?" "Not the kind you dig with picks. This was refined, compact, packed in drums lined with lead." "Dangerous?" Lydia asked. He hesitated. "They told us not to touch the crates barehanded." The word lead lingered in her mind. If true, the cargo could have contained high-density material, uranium ore, possibly, or experimental concentrate. That would explain the secrecy, the military-level clearance, the escort. And it would also explain why no one wanted the wreck examined too closely. That night, she returned to her notes. The sonar model replayed on her monitor, 2 shapes under the lake, one larger, one smaller, the gap between them narrowing as if caught mid-fall. She zoomed in, pausing the frame when the shadows overlapped. The smaller object bore angles too clean for natural debris. A second aircraft seemed less likely now, perhaps a container. The sonar engineer emailed her later, second object metallic. Density readings higher than aluminum. Could be a sealed alloy crate. Lydia printed the scan and taped it beside the red-lined map. The parallel paths now led not to mystery, but collision. She marked the second line with a pen, making it heavier, darker, as if the evidence itself wanted to be seen. The second red line ends in open water. The wind howled along the ridge when Lydia reached the old Callen cabin. It sat half-sunk in snowdrift, the roof bowed and the windows clouded with age. May Callen had lived there until the mid-1990s, long after most assumed the pilot's story was finished. Inside the rooms smelled of dust and cedar, but everything remained in order. Dishes stacked neatly, curtains drawn, the faint trace of aviation oil clinging to the floorboards. On the table sat a box labeled in pencil, Henry Weather Notes. Lydia eased it open. Inside lay a stack of flight charts, brittle wind speed forms, and a tin of old audio reels. The handwriting on the labels was Henry's calm, mechanical, the letters slanting right. One of the reels carried a tag that read, April Aklavik Run. She borrowed a portable player from the forensics van outside, threaded the tape, and pressed play. Static at first, then faint through the hiss, a male voice. Cessna 172 en route at 2,000 clear visibility. A pause. Then another voice, lower, female, clipped by a wind. Maintain altitude below radar range. Confirm escort clearance. Lydia froze. The line repeated once, distorted by the tape's age. The woman's tone carried authority, not panic, the cadence of someone used to issuing orders. Henry's reply came seconds later. Copy, holding below 400. The reel snapped tape, flapping loose. She documented the find, immediately labeling the tape as primary audio evidence. The chain of custody log dated it to 1958, consistent with period equipment. The presence of a second voice suggested communication with another aircraft or ground operator, but no such frequency was ever logged. Back in the cabin, Lydia found more weather charts annotated with pencil lines corresponding to the day's flight and a fragment of a printed radio transcript. The paper's torn edge matched exactly the missing portion of the recovered map from the lake. When overlapped, the tear lines fit like puzzle pieces. Whatever Henry was transmitting that day, it was to someone operating off record. In the corner of the cabin, a metal filing box held May's own notes. They weren't diary entries, more like confessions written to herself. He said they needed him only once, promised it was legal. Another line. When the letter came, I burned the rest. May had died in 1998, weeks after the sonar discovery of the plane. Her death certificate listed heart failure, but the neighbor who found her said the radio in her kitchen was still on, tuned to static. Lydia packed the reels and the charts into evidence sleeves. Before leaving, she looked back at the small wooden table where a cup still sat upside down on its saucer. On its rim, a faint ring of red dust caught the light ore residue, the kind that would only appear from handling raw material. Back at the lab, technicians restored the tape using magnetic resonance capture. The result was clearer. 2 full exchanges between Henry and the unidentified woman. One timestamp read 10:03 a.m., the last 10. 6 a.m. ended abruptly with an engine surge and a single phrase barely audible. He's not alone. The transcript analysis flagged several anomalies. No standard call signs, no confirmation protocols, and a consistent low-band frequency suggesting proximity as if the source were within sight. Lydia noted all this in her report. But what stayed with her was May's final note. I burned the rest. She returned to the cabin once more before the snow deepened. In the hearth, buried under gray ash, she found blackened paper fragments. One piece bore half a line of writing still visible through soot. Delivery, only if Hart approves. Hart. The surname struck her. She remembered a name buried in one of the 1950s civil service rosters, Evelyn Hart, assistant to the Department of Northern Resources, later married to a regional surveyor. The same department that absorbed the mine's files in 1964. Lydia photographed the fragment and sealed it. The chain of coincidence had become too precise to ignore an unidentified female voice on Henry's tape, a Hart signature in the archive, and May's burned confession linking both. When she returned to Whitehorse, the lab results awaited. The forensic acoustics report included one final note from the audio engineer: partial harmonics, confirm female voice. Age estimate late 30s. Accent Eastern Canadian. Lydia stared at the waveform printout. The voice pulsed in blue arcs across the paper, soft yet commanding. She pinned it above her desk beside the red-lined map. Under the lamplight, the tape fragment and the map's tear formed one continuous curve, as though both had once been part of the same sheet. Somewhere in that missing line between air and water, 2 people had shared a channel the world wasn't supposed to hear. A woman's faint voice on the tape says, "He's not alone." By the time the dive team arrived, the lake had turned to glass. Late spring sun melted the last shards of ice, and the air smelled faintly of copper and pine. Lydia stood on the bank as divers slipped beneath the surface air tanks, clinking like muted bells. Sonar guided them to the coordinates 26 feet down, where the Cessna lay half buried in silt. Within minutes, the radio crackled, visual on fuselage. Intact, door sealed. The retrieval took hours. Chains hummed through the winch as the small plane breached the surface water, spilling from the cabin windows like dark tears. Mud streaked its wings, but the registration number, CFKHT, remained legible. Inside the cockpit, Henry Callen's remains were still belted in the pilot's seat bones fused to rusted buckles. His watch, stopped at 10:08 a.m., was recovered intact. The co-pilot's seat was empty. In the rear, a single headset coiled against the floor cord frayed. A notebook floated free, its pages glued with mud. When the plane was drained and towed ashore, the notebook was opened under heat lamps. Most of its entries had melted into sepia stains, but a few words stood clear. "Pick up West Inlet," confirmed radio, and a rough sketch of the shoreline. Next to it, faint graphite notations repeated 400 several times the same number on the letter in May's charts. Lydia felt the pattern tightening. The flight wasn't random. Henry had been guided to a specific point, possibly for a rendezvous. But who was waiting at the inlet, and why had no second body surfaced? The forensic team catalogued every item: 2 flight maps, a corroded altimeter, fragments of cloth, and the severed headset cord. Under magnification, the cut was clean, too precise for decay. Someone had sliced it. The next discovery came when divers returned to search the debris field. 20 meters west of the fuselage, they found the smaller metallic object visible in sonar. It wasn't another aircraft. It was a crate. Its lid was bent inward, as if from impact, but the steel locks still held. A faint emblem was visible beneath algae, an interlocking DN, the mark of Dominion Northern Extraction Limited. The crate was lifted to the surface, its weight surprising even the divers. When opened under controlled conditions, it revealed only sediment and a few fragments of lining consistent with lead shielding. Whatever it had once held was long gone. Lydia took samples of the residue clinging to the inner walls. Preliminary tests showed traces of uranium oxide, minute but undeniable. It was the confirmation she'd been chasing. The ore Henry carried wasn't gold, but something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more secret. Inside the crate's hinge, lodged in silt, the lab found a small brass ring, an unmarked washer the size of a coin. Under scanning electron microscopy, microscopic fibers were embedded in its edge. The DNA trace was female. It didn't match May Callen. It didn't match anyone in the database. Lydia sat in her car that night listening again to the restored tape. The female voice repeated through static, "Maintain altitude below radar range. Confirm escort clearance." Each time she heard it, she imagined the unseen figure behind those words, the same voice that might have stood on the frozen inlet watching the plane descend. Back in the lab, the recovered headset lay sealed in evidence plastic. Under the fluorescent light, the ear pads gleamed faintly, still intact after decades underwater. Lydia noticed faint letters etched on the sideband, initials half rubbed away. EH. The same as the name burned into the paper fragment from May's hearth. She filed the finding, but couldn't let it rest. Who was EH? A radio operator. The woman on the tape. Someone tied to the mine's oversight. Every thread pointed back to Evelyn Hart, the civil servant whose name appeared on the redacted mining correspondence from 1958. When Lydia contacted her, the reply was polite but firm. "I was administrative staff only. I never handled field operations." Yet her tone faltered when Lydia mentioned the recovered headset. "I wouldn't know about that," she said, then paused. "I suggest you leave it buried. It's not all what it seems." The call ended abruptly. That night, Lydia logged the headset into the evidence inventory. Its chain of custody now complete, she stared at the photograph taped above her desk. The wreck half-submerged propeller tilted skyward like a cross. She thought of the voice on the tape of May's burnt confession and of the red line Henry had drawn across the lake. Every symbol led to the same place, West Inlet. The next morning, divers returned to that inlet for one final sweep. Nothing new surfaced, no bones, no wreckage. Only a strip of cloth caught on a submerged branch, fluttering like a signal flag in the current. The cloth matched the headset's padding material exactly. The headset cord is severed clean as if cut mid-flight. The walls of the RCMP archive room smelled of paper and ozone, the scent of sealed time. Lydia sat under the buzzing fluorescent tube, cross-referencing microfilm reels that hadn't been touched since the 1960s. Every reel was labeled in pencil mining export logs. 1957-1959 Department of Northern Resources. Confidential correspondence. She threaded one through the reader, the screen flickering to life with the gray glow of government type. The letters were dry administrative, yet something about their rhythm unsettled her transport authorization per directive. Shipments routed under experimental license. Export oversight suspended pending review. Each memo carried the same initials in the corner EH. Evelyn Hart. The pattern built like a whisper, becoming a scream. She had been there all along, not a clerk, not a bystander, but a gatekeeper of authorization. The very department that absorbed Dominion Northern's files had stamped every line she was now reading. Lydia leaned closer to the screen. On one reel, the date struck her April 9, 1958, 3 days before Henry's disappearance. The letter bore the header, Dominion Northern Extraction Limited, Logistics Division, and was addressed to the Department of Northern Resources. In its body, Special Courier Contracted, C-172 class aircraft, shipment designated number 47R. Clearance delayed due to change in escort protocol. Stamped beneath the line was the phrase, for field use A, Callen. Someone had mistyped his initial, but that error confirmed authorship. The document tied Henry directly to the operation. Lydia printed the frame, the gray ink bleeding faintly on her fingers. When she flipped the page, a second letter followed, unsigned, handwritten, and far more personal. It read, "He doesn't understand the value of what he's carrying. Keep him calm. I'll meet them by the lake." Below the handwriting, faint indentations formed 2 more words revealed only when Lydia tilted the page toward the light E. Hart. Outside, snow drifted against the window. Inside the archive, air felt thin. She gathered the documents into a file and drove to Evelyn Hart's retirement home in Inuvik. The facility overlooked the same low-lying hills that bordered the Mackenzie Delta, a quiet place with birch trees bending in the wind. Evelyn was waiting in the common room, shawl over her shoulders, eyes sharp despite the years. "I suppose you'd come eventually," she said before Lydia spoke. "I'm reopening the Callen case," Lydia replied. "You knew him?" Evelyn gave a slow nod. Everyone knew Henry. He flew the mail. He was decent. "You also knew about the cargo." The old woman's gaze drifted toward the window. "It wasn't gold," she murmured. "That's what people said, but it wasn't. The mine produced something else, uraninite ore, high-grade unstable. We were told it was research material. The shipments were supposed to go south for testing. The paperwork called it samples. But no one was supposed to transport it without escort. Yet you authorized his flight. I didn't choose him. They did." "Who?" Evelyn's lips tightened. "Ottawa. A committee that doesn't exist anymore. When the first crate went missing, they needed someone expendable to retrieve the rest. Henry agreed because they said it would clear his debts." Lydia's pen hovered above her notepad. "Debts," Evelyn gave a bitter smile. "May never told you the farm, the hangar, or mortgage to Dominion Northern. He thought this job would pay it off." The confession unspooled like thread pulled from a wound. "And the second aircraft?" Lydia asked. "There was no second aircraft," Evelyn said. "Only a relay. A small transmitter near the lake to guide him in. He was supposed to land on the ice and offload the crate, but the escort never arrived. Radio silence. When the storm rolled in, he panicked, tried to lift again. I heard it. You were on the radio. I was monitoring the channel. The last thing he said was my name." Her voice broke for the first time. Then nothing. Lydia reached into her bag and produced a photograph the headset recovered from the wreck. "We found this with his initials and yours. EH. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she touched the photo. He carried it as a spare. "I used the same model. I must have left mine in his hangar the day we tested the frequency." She drew a shaky breath. "When they told me the plane was lost, they ordered me to destroy the records. I signed what they wrote. Dominion Northern, closed within months." "What was in the crate?" Lydia asked softly. Evelyn's answer came as a whisper. "Concentrate from a Cold War site in the territories. We were moving it without clearance. The ore wasn't stable, it was hot. If the crate ruptured mid-flight, the contamination could have spread for miles. Is that why you warned him to stay below radar range?" "Yes. If anyone tracked him, there would have been questions we couldn't answer." Outside, wind pressed against the windows, rattling them like bones. Evelyn's eyes glistened. "I thought the water would bury it. But water doesn't keep secrets." Lydia closed her notebook slowly. The old woman's confession explained everything but one thing: the second female DNA found on the headset. Evelyn's medical file later showed she had never been in the north after the crash. Someone else had been in that plane. As Lydia left, Evelyn called after her voice hoarse. Those files were never meant to surface. That night, Lydia laid the documents across her hotel bed. The letters, the memo, the red map. Together, they drew the outline of a system built to erase itself. The next morning, she submitted the evidence summary to headquarters, noting the probable link between Dominion Northern and state export programs. She attached Evelyn's recorded statement. Within hours, the file was flagged restricted, access revoked. Her phone rang once. A voice she didn't know said, "You've done enough." Then the line went dead. Hart warns those files were never meant to surface. The wind had turned warmer by the time Lydia returned to Whitehorse, but the investigation felt colder than ever. The Hart statement was officially logged, yet all related attachments were sealed under national resource protocols. Her supervisor's message was short. Case closed, historical review only. But Lydia wasn't done. She still had a partial fingerprint, a severed headset, and a map that refused to fade. Every forensic piece whispered there was another passenger. She searched Evelyn Hart's archived personnel file, a stack of brittle sheets bound with twine. In the back pocket lay something unexpected, a personal envelope dated 1962 addressed to Paul Drent. Lydia recognized the name immediately, a historian who had helped her trace the mine's paperwork weeks earlier. The envelope was unsealed. Inside was a single object, a tarnished ring engraved on the inside with the letters HC plus EH. Her first reaction was disbelief. Henry Callen and Evelyn Hart, their initials bound together in metal. Lydia called Drent that night. He answered with a voice that trembled slightly. "I thought this might find its way to you," he said. "She asked me to keep it until someone reopened the case. Said it belonged to him." "To Henry." "To both of them," Drent replied. They were closer than anyone knew. He explained how Evelyn had once spent 2 weeks in Whitehorse during the mine inspections of 1957. She had flown with Henry several times, ostensibly for survey mapping. The rumors of an affair were never written, but everyone on the base had seen the glances, the small rituals, her handing him fuel, manifest him lingering near her office door. When the official investigation started, she erased any trace of their connection. The mine logs, the correspondence, all retyped without his name. Lydia asked where he had found the ring. "In her attic," Drent said, "wrapped in cloth with an old mining ledger. It smelled like lake water." He paused before adding, "The setting was cracked. When I had it cleaned, the jeweler found residue dark, compacted silt. The lab later confirmed it the same mineral composition as the sediment from Lake Aklavik. The ring had been underwater." Lydia laid the ring beside the map and headset photo, aligning their details like coordinates in a confession. The initials etched on the headset's band, EH, were no longer mysterious. She had been there. That realization reframed everything. The voice on the tape wasn't remote instruction. It was proximity, a second person in the cockpit. The altitude callouts, the tone, the timing all fit the cadence of an onboard conversation. Evelyn had lied about never flying north again. Still, one detail gnawed at Lydia, the missing second set of remains. If Evelyn had been with him, how had she escaped? Or had someone extracted her before the plane sank? She drove to Inuvik again, but the nursing home said Evelyn Hart had passed away 3 days earlier. The death certificate listed respiratory failure. Lydia requested a copy of her personal effects. Among them was a sealed envelope marked for LK in trembling cursive. Inside, a handwritten note. "By the time you read this, the water will have given back more than it should." Henry didn't crash. He landed where they told him. The escort failed, the ice broke, and I ran. He stayed to sink it. I made myself small enough to vanish. Don't let them call it an accident. No signature. Only a smear of red ink at the bottom, the same shade as the pencil mark on Henry's map. Lydia sat in her car, for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands. For the first time, she felt the ache beneath the evidence, a love buried under bureaucratic ruin. She logged the ring and letter as supplemental findings. Yet the department rejected their inclusion, citing non-forensic relevance. Officially, the narrative was complete. Henry Callen, pilot, perished in an aviation accident. Cargo unspecified, no mention of Evelyn Hart. But Lydia knew the truth was heavier than any ore that had ever passed through the Yukon sky. That night, she pinned the ring beside the red-lined map, a symbol of connection and silence. Under the lamplight, the reflection cast two intertwined circles on the wall, one bright, one shadowed. As she turned off the light, she caught herself whispering Henry's final words from the tape. "He's not alone." Evelyn had lived long enough to prove it, Evelyn whispers. They never meant for the plane to land. Snow drifted over the airfield again, the same wind that once lifted Henry's Cessna into a sky that had no mercy. Lydia stood near the hangar, watching clouds crawl east, her mind replaying the route, every red line, every missing mile. The case had been declared solved, but not to her. Too many artifacts told a story that didn't fit the official ending. A severed headset, a female DNA trace, a redacted memo, a ring that should have never surfaced. She spent the next weeks reconstructing the flight minute by minute. Using archived fuel logs, Henry's recorded departure weight, and 1958 meteorological reports, she charted the possible descent paths over Lake Aklavik. Each run-through ended at the same spot, the west inlet, precisely where the sonar had shown the crate. The evidence aligned not with an accidental crash, but a controlled ditching. The data told a consistent truth. The Cessna's last known altitude, 400 feet. The frozen altimeter recovered from the cockpit, also 400. That number had appeared in every artifact, the letter, the charts, the map. It wasn't coincidence. It was instruction. Henry had obeyed the directive. When the accident reconstruction model was complete, the conclusion was clear. The descent angle was too shallow for an engine failure. He'd lowered the nose deliberately, almost level, as if to land, then sealed the throttle and went silent. A pilot's version of confession. Lydia's report stated impact trajectory consistent with intentional water landing. Evidence suggests pilot awareness and possible control until submersion. Her supervisor returned it, stamped speculative. Rephrase controlled descent due to mechanical failure. She rephrased nothing. Instead, she tracked the aircraft registry transfer records from that year. Dominion Northern had leased the Cessna through a shell entity, an operation dissolved within weeks of the crash. Its owner of record was not Henry Callen, but E. Hart and Associates. The corporate name had never appeared in any Yukon archive until that moment. Evelyn's field involvement had not ended with one flight. It had started it. The deeper Lydia looked, the clearer the design became. The disappearance wasn't cover-up by accident, it was procedure. Henry's flight carried a crate the government couldn't retrieve and a woman it couldn't name. One drowned, one vanished. The official investigation filed both as weather casualty. When Lydia re-entered the flight simulator data, she overlaid the lake's topography with fuel burn ratios. The numbers showed he'd turned back west seconds before losing altitude toward the mining corridor, not away. He hadn't fled. He'd tried to return the cargo. The altimeter's frozen reading 400 feet placed the final radio call almost exactly above the inlet where the crate had been found. The two red lines on the map converged there. She understood now why May's letter had ended mid-sentence. Henry had written it knowing he would never land. At 11:20 that night, Lydia sat in her office, surrounded by every object that mattered: the ring, the map, the letter, the photograph of the wreck. She realized they formed not a tragedy, but an equation, an unbalanced one. Evelyn had survived. Henry had not. The ore had disappeared. Someone had collected it before the lake froze. She wrote one last note in her private log. Recovered evidence implies premeditated disposal. Purpose, containment or concealment. Pilot, complicit under duress. The following morning, she met Dr. Ron Weaver, the aviation expert who'd assisted with the reconstruction. They stood before the recovered plane, now cleaned and dry under the hangar lights. Its paint had faded to a soft gray, every rivet visible. Weaver ran his fingers along the wing's edge. "You see this line," he said. "No structural shear. He didn't crash, he landed." Lydia nodded. "Then why didn't he get out?" Weaver looked toward the cockpit. Maybe he thought sinking it was the only way to stop what came next. He handed her the altimeter. The needle was frozen, its face cracked but legible. He'd etched a small label on its underside. Recovered, April 1997. Lake Aklavik, altitude 400. The evidence tag would enter the record as routine. Yet to Lydia, it was the final confession of a man who'd obeyed orders too faithfully. When she returned to her desk, she unfolded Henry's map one last time. The two red lines, drawn decades apart by different hands, overlapped perfectly. The ink had faded, but the impression was deep enough to catch light. She realized the second line had not been added later. It had always been there, pressed faintly beneath the surface, like a ghost route only visible after the paper aged. Henry had mapped his own burial. As dusk fell, Lydia logged her final report. Case conclusion: evidence supports intentional ditching consistent with pilot control. Probable cause: containment of hazardous material. Motive classified. She sealed the envelope, knowing it would vanish into a government archive like the ones she'd already uncovered. The truth would remain technically acknowledged, but emotionally buried. When she walked out of the office, the map lay under the desk lamp, its red marks glowing faintly against the pale paper, two veins meeting in the cold heart of a lake. Weaver's voice echoed in her mind, soft as the wind outside. He tried to turn back, too late. The inquiry opened quietly, almost apologetically. No press, no public statement, just a closed hearing inside a beige government building in Ottawa, where air vents hummed louder than voices. Lydia sat at a narrow table, flanked by her evidence binders. Across from her, the panel of three officials shuffled papers that had already been decided. The file number read RCMP, Cold Case Review. Callen Henry, 1958. The chairwoman began with a neutral tone. Sergeant Callen, we're here to confirm procedural closure. The crash has been ruled accidental. Your report, however, suggests external involvement. We'd like clarification before the file is sealed. Lydia nodded, her throat dry. Yes, ma'am. Evidence recovered from the aircraft and associated artifacts indicates an intentional ditching consistent with containment of hazardous material. The material in question was misidentified in 1958 as mineral ore. Recent analysis shows uranium concentrate. That word uranium made the room shift. The youngest panelist stopped writing. The chairwoman frowned. You're suggesting a Cold War-era smuggling operation? Not smuggling, Lydia said carefully. Sanctioned transport under a classified export program. Dominion Northern Extraction acted as the intermediary. The cargo was scheduled for handoff near Aklavik. It never completed. She placed the map on the table. Beneath the fluorescent light, the two red lines shimmered like open veins. The pilot followed instructions to remain below radar range. The altimeter froze at 400 feet, which matches a controlled water landing. He was accompanied by one unauthorized passenger, later identified as Evelyn Hart, federal employee. She survived. He did not. The panel exchanged glances. And Miss Hart, the chairwoman asked. Deceased. Confession recovered posthumously. She corroborates the instructions, including the phrase, containment by submersion. Silence. One of the men cleared his throat. Sergeant, these are historic events. The individuals responsible are gone. The evidence, though compelling, borders on circumstantial. Are you recommending criminal review? No, Lydia said. I'm recommending transparency. The case was closed as an accident. It wasn't. The record should reflect intent. The chairwoman leaned forward. Intent to do what? To bury a national liability beneath a lake. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the vents filled the room again, a soft metallic drone. Then the chairwoman folded her hands. Your findings will be reviewed. For now, we retain the official classification. Pilot error, mechanical failure, no foul play. Lydia looked down at the map, her only weapon, and realized how easily truth could drown. Outside, snow swirled under gray sky. She walked the length of Wellington Street, the cold biting through her coat. The envelope in her pocket felt heavier than gold lab results from the residue scraped off the crate's interior. She'd asked Dr. Yates for one last verification. His note had arrived that morning. Spectral analysis confirms uranium oxide. Purity exceeding industrial grade. Not ore, refined concentrate. She stopped under a streetlight and read it again. The last line in Yates's handwriting chilled her. Unclear why documentation lists gold, possible, deliberate substitution. The cover-up had been written in ink from the start. That night, she returned to the evidence room. The recovered crate sat in isolation, its walls scraped clean, nothing left but the faint scent of oxidized metal. Beside it lay the ring, the headset, and the map sealed in a transparent case. Each item bore a label. Each label an inventory code, tidy fragments of something no tidy language could contain. She looked at the exhibit tags, recovered from Lake Aklavik, Yukon. 1997. Associated with aircraft CFKHT. At the bottom in smaller type case reference closed, pilot error confirmed, but on the internal form under research request, someone had scrawled a note in blue pen. Refer to energy division. Sensitive material. Even now the circle remained unbroken bureaucracy, swallowing its own echo. Weeks later, she received an email with a single attachment, the formal closure notice. The first line read, "Inquiry completed. All evidence retained under controlled archive. No further publication authorized." The second line, added by her supervisor in smaller font, said, "Appreciate your dedication. Time to move on." Lydia did not move on. She requested one copy of the final hearing transcript. On the last page, the chairwoman's summary stood as the official word. The disappearance of pilot Henry Callen was the result of navigational error and adverse weather conditions. The discovery of refined material does not alter the nature of the event. Case closed. And then below it, a single unexplained blank line, as if something had been redacted, but the redaction forgotten. In her private notes, Lydia wrote one sentence: "Every silence in the record has a name." The following week, she stood in a small Yukon courthouse as the case artifacts were entered into permanent archive. The judge's gavel echoed once, and the map was officially labeled Exhibit A, Provenance Unknown. She watched the clerk slide it beneath glass, its faded red line glowing under sterile light. The judge announced, "All items admitted into federal custody." Closure affirmed. No one looked up. No one noticed that on the edge of the map, just beneath the crease, a faint stain spread outward. A trace of something chemical reactive, maybe radioactive still. Lydia's pulse slowed as she stared. The paper seemed alive, breathing under glass. The line pulsed faintly crimson like blood rediscovered. The judge's gavel fell again. The judge's gavel falls, but one folder remains sealed. The archive room was silent except for the slow tick of the temperature regulator, a sound that might have been mistaken for a heartbeat if one stayed long enough. Lydia stood before the sealed display, her reflection ghosted across the glass. The case was officially closed now, filed under solved mechanical failure. The headlines were polite, forgettable. Lost Yukon pilot. Identified after 40 years. But the truth lay flattened beneath the plexiglass in front of her, the water-stained map folded twice, red lines still bleeding faintly through the paper. She filled out her final chain of custody form, transfer to Permanent Archive RCMP Historical Division. Her signature was just a line among hundreds of others. The archivist beside her, a quiet man named Collier, checked boxes without looking up. "That'll do it," he said. "File's now complete." "Nothing's complete," Lydia murmured. Collier hesitated. "I read your report," he said softly. "Did you ever find proof it was uranium?" "Proof enough." He nodded, uncertain. "They won't unseal it. You know that." "I don't need them to." She turned back to the glass. "It's already leaking through the cracks." He smiled faintly, thinking she meant the bureaucracy. She didn't correct him. When he left, she remained alone with the evidence. The air smelled faintly of ozone and varnish, the sterile scent of history being buried. She leaned close to the display case and traced the shape of the lake on the map with her eyes. Every curve had been drawn by a hand that knew it was running out of time. In the next drawer down sat Henry's watch, still stopped at 10:08 a.m. Its face was clouded, its crystal fractured into a spider web of cracks. Beneath it, the ring HC plus EH lay darkened with tarnish. The engravings were soft now, almost melting into the metal. She knew they'd eventually fade completely, like all human signatures do. Before she left, she filed one final addendum, unofficial and unapproved, tucked behind the standard closure notice. It read, "Recovered materials confirm coordinated suppression of evidence related to hazardous export. Pilot Callen's actions likely deliberate. Secondary participant confirmed as Evelyn Hart. Motive containment of classified cargo. Official record incomplete by design." She didn't sign it. Some truths were safer unsigned. That night, she walked down to the edge of the Yukon River. The sky was the same bruised color it must have been the morning Henry vanished. The wind carried the scent of thawing earth, and the current murmured softly against the shore. Lydia opened her notebook and drew a single red line from one page to the next, unbroken steady, then tore it out and let it fall into the water. The paper floated for a moment before darkening and sinking. She thought of May waiting by the kitchen lamp, of Evelyn carrying guilt across decades, of Henry banking low over the frozen inlet with a secret too heavy to land. None of them villains. None of them saints. Just people folded into the machinery of their time, used, silenced, forgotten. At 4 p.m. the sun dipped behind the spruce ridge. Light fractured across the river like shrapnel. Lydia turned away and walked toward the road, the sound of wind-blown gravel trailing her steps. Weeks later, a clerk in the archive logged a note, "Residual trace detected in map display hydrocarbon anomaly." The notation was ignored. No follow-up performed. Years after that, the archive room was renovated. The artifacts were moved to climate-controlled storage in Ottawa. The map, still sealed under glass, had faded almost to sepia, except for the red line. Under ultraviolet light, it still glowed faintly, as though drawn with something that refused to die. And when the lights were off in the quiet hours before dawn, the guards sometimes swore they could hear a faint ticking from inside the case, a rhythm too steady to be the regulator, too human to be a trick of echo. Beneath the glass, the red line still bleeds faintly in light.